This meeting is being recorded.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to today's MAI webinar, A Story to Tell, Writing the Collaborative Memoir. 61 have registered to attend this webinar from around 25 countries. Thank you for being here. Special welcome to those of you who are joining us for the first time. Just a reminder to everyone that please take note of your questions and ask them towards the end of our session through the chat window or the Q&A. We have allotted 15 minutes for your questions towards the end of the presentation. This is Ramon Rocha from MAI, and I'm just thankful for technology that I'm able to host this webinar from Laos. Let me go straight to introducing our speaker. Award-winning novelist and investigative journalist Jeanette Windle has written 21 fiction and nonfiction titles, including bestsellers like Veiled Freedom and Freedom Stand. Her book, All Saints, was made into a movie by Sony Affirm Films. Jeanette mentors writers from all the 5 continents. Please welcome Jeanette Windle.
It's a pleasure to be here. Good morning or good evening, depending on your time zone. It's especially a pleasure to share with us brothers and sisters of the MAI global family today. Our topic, as you know, is writing the collaborative memoir. And we're going to be looking at a very simple but effective pattern for taking somebody else's life story and making it both a compelling and inspirational read. In fact, if after this workshop you go back and pick up some of your favorite true life titles, I think you will be able to see this pattern in virtually any bestseller of this genre. We will not be talking about writing the autobiography, but every point we are covering today applies as well if you are writing your own life story. I am going to be including in the PowerPoint a number of examples for every point we are covering, also in the handout. Because we have an abbreviated time, we won't be looking at the examples live, but afterwards you can go back and read them in context with whatever principle I was covering at that time. You're also going to find a few examples and points that we're cutting from this webinar for reasons of time. So basically we have, let me make sure we have our PowerPoint moving here. Okay, I'm having a little bit of difficulty making my PowerPoint move. Okay. There we go. Do you see that? Okay, sorry, technology. Basically, there are 2 types of true life story, and you've probably read both. The first is biography. Billy Graham, Dancing from Darkness is a biography that I had the privilege of writing. Champion, David Waweru, MAI affiliate in Kenya, his book Champion is an example of biography. The other is the life crisis. You may remember Prisoners of Hope, the missionaries captive in Afghanistan, In the Presence of Mine Enemies, 90 Minutes in Heaven. 2 such books that I had the privilege of writing were Hope Underground, the story of the Chilean mine rescue that was watched by 2 billion people at one time, and All Saints, as mentioned, that became a movie. Going to be using in the process today a number of examples from my own titles, not because they're better, but because I know the story well and can use those particular principles. So there are going to be 3 main steps we're going to look at this morning to writing this type of book. And the first is going to be gathering our material, then organizing that material into a coherent outline, and then of course writing the book. So we're going to take a quick walk through each. And if at any point I leave you with a question, we'll have some time at the end to ask those questions, but you can also feel free to email me with follow-up questions after the webinar. So our first step, gathering the material. There's two main steps to gathering the material of this type of book. And of course, the first one is interview. Whether you're interviewing yourself, if you're writing an autobiography, whether you're interviewing a primary subject. In my case, I wrote Forgiven Amish School Shooting. The primary subject was Terry Roberts. When I was writing All Saints, the story of Myanmar Christian refugees and a dying Tennessee church and what happened when God brought them together. The pastor of that church, Michael Spurlock, was my primary source. When I was writing Hope Underground, the Chilean miner rescue story, Pastor Carlos Parra, the chaplain that was there during that entire time, was my primary source. So your first interview is going to be your primary sources. You're probably also going to have secondary sources, depending on what type of a story there is. And then after interview, you're going to be doing research, and we're going to be talking about that later. But I want to spend a little bit of time this morning talking about interview, because how we get our material is sometimes as difficult as turning that material into a great book. So first, interviews. How do we do our interviews? And there's a couple of options. Some people like to record an interview. There is a Dragon program that you can talk into your computer and just tape. I will say my personal preference, and this is how I do all of my interviews, is because I'm a good typist, I sit there with my computer and I let my interview subjects pour their hearts through my fingers onto my screen. So that saves me a lot of time because I don't have to then later take tapes and type them up myself. But that's up to you. I usually figure 20 to 30 hours interviews for a 50,000 book. When I get done with my interviews, by the end of 20 to 30 hour interviews, I will typically have 40,000 words of raw notes that I am then turning into. And so I want to share just a little bit about how I go about interviewing, because this is something that will be important as you write this type of a book. And the first is basically that I sit down with my interview person and I give them a few pointers. First, always block out plenty of time. You can't truly get somebody to spill their heart to you if you're in a hurry. And so I always figure a good period of time to do an interview and then get comfortable. I will often put my interview subject in a chair with their feet up, sit across from them with feet up with my computer, and then I look at them and I give them a few pointers before they ever start speaking. And here are just a few of the questions that I will give, or I will say to my interview subject if we start talking. And the first is this: I will say, just tell your story in as much detail as possible. It doesn't have to be organized. It doesn't have to be what's going to end up in the book. Just the more you can give me, the more material I have to write your story. And the second is, be sure to include your emotions, your reactions, your spiritual applications, your takeaway for the reader, whatever is on your heart that you have gone through or that God has said to you, speak it out to me. Again, don't worry about being organized. Don't worry about being chronological. You don't have to have good wording, because I will do that afterwards. And then I will give them a very important point, in part because sometimes I'm interviewing in many different cultures where interruptions, for instance, are not polite. So I will say in advance, I will say, as you're talking, I will routinely be interrupting. I will routinely be interrupting you. This isn't to be rude. It's because while you're talking, I may think of an additional detail I need. I need you to give me a little bit more of your reaction, what you were feeling at the time, what God was saying. What is the chronology? So just know in advance that if I interrupt you, it's for the purpose of the book. It's not to be rude. And then finally, I let them know that, especially when I am doing a crisis type book where the person has gone through great trauma, that it may be very difficult for them to tell their story. And so I will just let them know, this is between you and me. I have complete confidentiality. Nothing will ever end up in print without your permission. So feel free to let out your heart. Feel free to cry. If you can't go any further, we'll take a break. If we need to come back tomorrow, that's fine. Just let your heart spill out to me. So that's basically how I do interviews. And by the end of that time, I will usually have, as I've said, 20 to 30 hours. I will have probably 40,000 words in raw notes. So the next question is, I'm doing an interview. What do I want my interview subject, or conversely, if I'm doing an autobiography, what do I want to include? And what I will say is always this: think scenes. If you're watching a movie, if you're reading a book, you're looking at scenes. And there is, in every person's life who has a story to tell, there will be certain stories of their lives that they constantly tell. And I love this particular piece that came out of the book I wrote on the Chilean mine rescue. And this is the only quote that I'm actually going to read in person. And this was from the Carlos Diaz. And he talked about in his interview how we tell the same stories again and again. Stories of terrible hardship and great courage underground, of stunning engineering achievements and scientific ingenuity on the surface. Family dramas, both distressing and heartwarming. Moments of near despair and ultimate triumph. But there is another side to this story that needs to be told, a spiritual side. No account of the greatest mine rescue of all time would be complete without telling the stories of faith discovered and hope shared. And just to go on from there, when you are doing an interview, the person you are talking to has probably told certain stories about their journey, about whatever happened over and over and over again. They may even be stories that were in the news. Those stories will be the key stories to telling their life story as well. And I just wanted to give one tiny example. This is when I was writing All Saints, the Myanmar refugee story. And as you can see on the top, and you can read this for yourself yesterday or later, you can see some of the raw notes as this particular person, Ye Win, the boy soldier from Myanmar, was telling me his story. At the bottom, you can see a bit of the completed scene once I took those raw notes and turned them into a live story. So the first thing you're going to want to do is collect their stories. Let them tell their stories to you, get them down. And then the next one that's equally important is as they're telling their stories, and here's where I will often be interrupting, write down as well, because this is what's going to become the spiritual thread and theme of your book. And here are the 3 points that I will always suggest to tell me. First, for every single story, not just their lives in general, but every story as they're telling it, what were the emotional and spiritual high and low points of those events, that story, that crisis? And what are the things that God has taught through those events or life story or crisis? And I have found that even when I'm telling the story of someone who at the point of the story that I'm capturing did not yet know God, something happened in that story or crisis that either was their reaction against God, their search for God, or something that they heard from God that will still become a part of the God theme, even in a part of the story that they did not yet know God. And then I will continually be probing, what do you want your reader to take away? What is it that makes you want to write this book? Because God spoke to you so powerfully that a reader needs to know this story so they can take it away into their life. And meanwhile, I am typing all of this up madly into my computer screen. So this is just one small example Dancing from Darkness, the story of a World War II survivor dropped off in the East German zone of Hitler's regime at 2 years old as a young American child. And this was just a little bit of the notes. One of my clients that more than anyone had told her story so many times that even as she's telling it to me, she could tell me the God application at every point of her life story. And this was just a little bit that I won't read the whole thing, but if you look at the bottom, that moment, which was the moment when the first bomb fell and it missed this 9-year-old girl, was when the certainty of an invisible presence became truly real to me for the first time. Someone arranged that bomb to fall over there instead of over here. And whoever that one is, he must be very smart to know where the bombs would fall. And he must know me too, and like me a little, to keep that bomb from killing me. And then that she goes on, and that was her first recognition that there could possibly be God out there. So gathering those spiritual points. So you're going to gather the scenes, the stories. You're going to gather the emotional and spiritual journey of the person. Then how do you tie all this together? You need to also gather the biographical and historical details connecting significant scenes. Too often, the hardest part of putting this type of book together is the missing pieces, because people have stories they tell over and over, but you don't have the chronological skeleton to know where they really fit into their life story. And so you want to make sure you gather all of that material and passage of time and historical data between the key scenes of the person's story. And one way to do that is by creating a thorough timeline. I will typically have my clients, and if you're writing your own, do the same. Write down for me. I will make a list of everything they've talked about that I don't understand where and when it happened. And I will ask them to say, make me a simple timeline saying, okay, this is at least the year when something happened, even if we're not sure about the exact date. And then there's your material. Interview material, everything by now is probably this huge mass of raw data, as you've seen. The next book is it has to be put together with research. Too often a memoir becomes somebody's memories, but the reader doesn't know the person, doesn't know the context. And so without solid research on your part to tie it all together, it becomes something that a reader outside the personal family cannot follow. And so your interview scenes and story need to be woven together into a solid background. And that includes the historical, geographical, and political setting. Part of that is, of course, the setting itself. And when I'm writing a story like this, the first thing I'm doing when I finish my notes, if I can drive to the scene. I can go to the place. I was able to do that with the Amish school shooting, with the All Saints story. Others, you don't have a choice. I was not able to go to the Akatama Desert where the Chilean mine rescue happened. But we live in a wonderful time today. It's called the internet. And not only is there information out there for everything you need, there is also video and photos. And so one thing I do, and I urge, even if you're writing about someone within your own culture and close by, make sure that you can see in your mind's eye the places and the events. And that's more easily done through internet research than trying to get a description out of the person involved. One good example was when I was writing the Chilean mine rescue. I knew that the James Bond movie Quantum of Solace, Daniel Craig, was filmed in the Akatama Desert. So I literally rented that movie and I watched the scenes of the Akatama Desert so that I could capture what it looked like. I recently finished a memoir of a Liberian Civil War survivor, SIM missionary in Liberia, former Muslim, who was part of the Civil War on the Elwa compound, the big missions radio compound in Liberia. And I literally went to the internet and I was able to pull pull up both video and photos, not just of the compound and the historical background, but of what it was like during the Civil War when this person was caught there. So research, doing setting, historical contemporary events. A good example, when I was writing The Dancing from Darkness, the World War II survivor book, she was a child, so she often had no idea of the political context of the story she was telling me. I went in research and I discovered, for example, that she managed to step across the East Berlin border just the same week that the wall went up. And if God had not opened the door for her to get out that week, she would have never gotten out. She didn't even know that. And issues like that I was able to weave into her story by doing research into the historical background. Another important step is simply checking details. When I was writing All Saints, some of the stories that I was getting out of the Myanmar former boy soldiers and rebels and refugees were so incredible, I felt that I really had to check and make sure that all the details were accurate. And so I did that, and I was actually able to find one particular clip, Ye Win, the boy soldier, a story he told me of being put on the immigration blacklist from the American embassy because he was leading the student riots in front of the Myanmar embassy of pro-democracy. And I researched, and I was actually able to find a CNN clip and I still have that clip, where he is walking with a flag, fist in the air, protesting in front of the Myanmar embassy. And I could check that off and say, yes, he's telling me the actual truth of these stories. So the research allows you, like any good journalist, to put background to the interview stories that you have received. And if you're writing your own story, it's just as important. Journals, and this is another thing I do, is always, I will get whatever material that the person has written down. Often they have tried to write a book themselves first, and so they will have journal entries, material written down, photos, auxiliary material, and by here, this was the one I mentioned, fact checking. Here, this when I was doing the Forgiven, the Amish school shooting story, the person involved had received hundreds and hundreds of cards from Amish people expressing their forgiveness. And so again, I take all of that, put it into my pile, and by now I have, as you can see, a huge amount of raw material that now needs to be turned into a book. So we've got our material. Now the time comes to organize that material into a book. And let me take just a sip of water here. Okay, just a few points to keep in mind as you are organizing your material, because now you have probably far more than you can ever turn into a book, even if it's your book that you're writing. So just a few points to keep in mind as you're writing. The first is think hook. Anytime we read or write a book, we're told you need to have a hook to bring in the reader. And think hook. And the first is, again, what significance or draw will this particular story have to draw readers? It may be because the person is famous, like Billy Graham. In the case of David Waweru's Champion, A Dancing from Darkness, All Saints, it's because there was a life story that was so fascinating and so contemporary to people today that people are willing to read it, even if they have no idea who this person is initially. Or a life crisis, Hope Underground, the Chilean miner rescue, Forgiven, the Amish school shooting, 90 Minutes in Heaven, a person who was dead for 90 minutes and came back, etc. Typically this type of book, something has happened that made this event hit the news, and now there's the opportunity to tell this story because people want to know what the full story was behind that news story. So, hook. Then think theme. And here is where your raw material is going to come into hand. When I'm taking interviews, I always keep in the back of my mind as I'm listening to this person spill out their heart onto my computer screen. What is the overall message and thoughts and images that are important to this primary person that's reading? Just a few examples, and you can read them later. Forgiven. The storms. She kept coming back to the images of the storms and how this tsunami had swept away her life when her son became the person who killed these Amish school children. Dancing from darkness. Puzzle pieces. How this mosaic of this drab life could possibly be puzzle pieces that God was piecing together to make something beautiful. And that came through over and over again as she spoke. So think of the imagery, the themes, and then what impact. And again, this will come from the heart of the person speaking, not from you as the person writing the story, unless you're writing your own story. But what is the impact, the lesson, the message that this person's life has that makes it worth putting 50,000 words in text and spending the time and effort to publish it? Everyone has a story. What about this story makes it worth publishing? And again, I take this out of their own talking. Forgiven, Carrie Roberts' story, the whole theme of forgiveness, how these Amish could forgive the family of somebody who did something so desperate. And in her case, themes of surrender versus survival. Hope Underground, the theme that came in over and over in the interviews was this God's presence. The story that was told of these 34 flags planted on a hill because there had been counted 34 miners. And in the end, there were only 33. But every miner agreed that the 34th miner was God who was with them down there in that hole. So that's the kind of theme and imagery. Champion, David Waweru, Word Alive publisher in Nairobi. And his theme was that of being a boxer. That's his imagery. The champion, living your dream and becoming a champion, was of course the theme that came through his story. And then in All Saints, and I'll let you read that later, but floods and replanting. Just as floods wipe away, but farmer replants, so the floods may come into our lives. But as God's people, we get back, we replant, we have faith, we go on. Okay. So you have your hook, you have your theme. Now you're going to start thinking, how am I going to pull this whole book together? And the first thought is, again, think chronology. The easiest way to write a book is, of course, chronologically. And so the easiest way to take your stories is to take all those key stories you've been told and put them into a basic chronological order. There's one major way to tell this story that I say every book I've written has used, and probably most books of this sort have used. And that's what we call the flashback, weaving between the present and the past. Especially if you're telling a story that's a life crisis or a news story, you want to be coming in with the current story that people have heard on the news. But then you want to go back and tell the story of everything that led up to that point. And the easiest way to do that is, as I use in my books, is a flashback sequence where you're telling part of the story in the present and then weaving in the backstory. All same title. If you ever get a chance, that is one book that uses this particular principle. Multiple points of view. If you're writing numerous principles like All Saints, you will have multiple points of view. Given many titles, if you're writing one person's story, you will probably just have that person's point of view. If you're writing the biography, let me just go back to that. You may come in at a point of crisis, but you're basically going to then tell that person's story, whether it's Billy Graham's or Eleanor Isaacson, World War II survivor. You will be telling the story basically in a chronological order. So your two basic patterns are either, if it's a biography, you tell it chronologically with all of those key stories placed in their chronological order. If it's a news type, you're going to be probably using that flashback system where you're telling parts of the present story and weaving in parts of the backstory. And there we go, think scenes. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit more about this, but again, your organization is going to be taking your basic scenes and then weaving those scenes together with the transitional material that allows you to create a seamless chronology, a seamless timeline for the reader, so the reader can follow this person's story. Okay, just a few points as we go forward, and I want to make sure we leave plenty of time for questions. But voice. Are you going to write this story in first person or in third person? And it's very simple. If you are telling one person's story, even if it's your story or you're writing someone else's, you will probably write it in first person. Every person's story that I've told, that just their story, has been told in first person. If the story has multiple subjects and multiple timelines and people, the easiest is to write in third person. So All Saints, where we had two main subjects, Wynne, the boy soldier, Father Michael Spurlock, the pastor, and dozens more who cross in and out of this incredible story that became an incredible movie. We told that in third person because it wasn't any one person's first person story. So again, if you're doing one person's story, first person, here is the important thing if you're writing somebody else's story. You want to bring journalistic excellence. You want the story to be well written, but you also want it to be their voice and not yours. So the key is to let their voice spill out. And then as you pull that all together, beautifully writing the story, make sure it's their images, their message, their pain, their joys that come out, their voice and not yours on the page. So we've now gathered material, we've organized it, and now we're ready for the easy part, reading the book. So just a few points to go over in writing the book. And I want to give a shout out as we do this to an excellent book of this example, if you ever can find it online. John Moss wrote a wonderful book called New Song in the Andes. It was the story of the great revival of the Quechua people in Ecuador, and I had the wonderful privilege of reading it because I got to translate it into Spanish. And it is a perfect example of taking the third person weaving of all of those different stories and tying them together chronologically into a really exciting story. So if you can find it, John Moss, New Song in the Andes, look for it on the internet. So now we're going to write our story. And here's where we're going to start. We're always going to, this is the pattern you want to follow. You can break out of this pattern if you do it well, but this pattern that if you pick up 99% probably of such titles, it will follow this pattern. So the first thing is your prologue. You're going to come in with a prologue. This is not the beginning of the story. The prologue is going to be your introduction, or rather your subject's introduction of themselves, the subject of the story, and the purpose of writing to the reader. And there's 3 points you want to make sure you include in your prologue. The first is, of course, introducing the subject of the story. The second is introducing the major crisis or reason for the story. If you're writing a book that's not based on a news story, you may not have a crisis, but there will be a reason, there will be a passion, there will be a purpose for the reason that this person wants their story told. And then you're going to introduce the theme and the hook. I'm going to give you a couple of examples, and then you can read them at leisure, and you will find a few more in your handout. But here's just one example. This is just a small clip from Hope Underground, and I want you to notice that in just this small clip, you will see all 3 of those points. I'm just going to read the highlighted text. The survival and rescue of the 33 San Jose miners. There's the crisis. This is the story in which I was privileged to participate during my time as chaplain of Camp Hope. There's the subject, the person whose story is being told. May its pages offer an equivocal testimony that in this 21st century, Faith still does move mountains. And that became the theme running throughout the book. So that prologue is going to introduce your story. Now, you're going to start telling the story itself. And that is going to begin, chapter 1, you want to begin at a point of crisis or drama. Even if you're telling a biography, there has to be a reason why people want to read this biography. And whatever scene or story is so powerful in their lives that it deserves writing their story, that will be the first scene of your book. You want to come in at that point of crisis and drama. And this is just an example from Dancing from Darkness. I will let you read that later. But it is the story of the Christmas Eve miracle whereby this little girl who became Eleanor Isaacson should have died, did not die. And at the end of it, this first time she ever heard the word God in her life was when her atheist aunt looked at her and said, "Well, Eleanor, I guess God didn't want us to die tonight." And for the first time, she knew who that invisible friend was that might possibly care about her. So coming in at a point of crisis, writing the book, as you come in at that point of crisis, you're going to want to set the scene. This is where you're going to give historical background. In the example here, this is the war zone in Myanmar where Ye Win, the boy soldier of All Saints, has his first great encounter with God. And I'm not going to go into that in depth, but setting the scene. Now, as you write the book, and here are just a few principles, we are often told to show, don't tell. If you've ever had a writing teacher, I'm sure you've heard that principle. Here's the reality, especially for writing a memoir. You want to show and you want to tell. And the reason is this: you only have so many words to capture an entire person's life story. So here is the reality. When you are telling those scenes, those stories that are told over and over that you've captured, you want to tell them in what we call show. Write them with the vividness as though you were writing a novel. Then tell, you're going to be using the tell for that chronology. How do you piece together all those stories? Very quickly, by telling, you can tell the passing of time, the chronology, what events quickly happen to move on to the next scene. So use the chronology tell to tie your scenes together. And throughout the book, it should be a combination of both. It's just one example, and I'll let you read this later. But you will see in the examples how even a true life scene can be made as exciting as a Tom Clancy novel. Again, and here's an example transition. It's one short paragraph that's showing the passage of 3 or 4 years of time between one scene to the next scene in this person's life. Okay, forgiven, just a few of the transitions. I'll let you read them at your leisure. Now, when we're writing the book, one thing we want to keep in mind is we're journalists, we're writers. This is a story, but it needs to be told with all of the excellence and excitement of writing a best-selling novel. And we do that by using the principles of narrative prose. We won't go into these in great detail here, but what I'm going to do, and I've left you in your notes, is an example of an exercise I use, whether for fiction or nonfiction, for making sure that you have great description, emotion, action in your writing. And here are just very quickly going over the principles. First, you want to make sure you use the 6 senses: sight, sound, smell, taste, touch. People will often say, no, there's only 5 senses. Not for the writer. The most important sense for the writer is emotion. And that emotion must come into the story as well as the 5 physical senses. You want to use action verbs, descriptive nouns. You don't want to tell a story, you want to paint images for the reader. And then dialogue. So here's just an example. I'm going to let you read these later. But if you go through these samples, you will see that I use virtually every single one of the senses, and I do it deliberately. And this is the little exercise I'm going to leave you for homework. It's a very simple exercise that you can do in looking at your writing. Simply I make a chart like this, the 6 senses, and then I'm looking at my prose, and I'll say, and you can see here examples you can check out later. Am I using the sense of sight? We tend to overuse sight and nothing else. Am I including the sounds, the smells, the touch, the taste, the emotions? And if you can't read 2 pages of your writing and find at least 4 out of the 6 senses, including emotion, definitely, then you need to go back and say, I need to write this more vividly. So using those senses, and here are some examples. I'll just let you check those later. Dialogue. Your dialogue needs to be natural. When you're having somebody tell you a story, they're telling you what they talked about. They're not giving you the actual dialogue. But you have that option, and what you should be doing is, of course, turning that into real dialogue. And this is just an example. You can check. These are my notes of a scene out of Forgiven. Here is the final dialogue. You may say, but that's not really the dialogue that they said. What if the words are different? Well, what I do is I simply run back the dialogue by the people who were in the interview. If they say, yeah, that reflects what I said, then it's fine. Otherwise, they may say, well, I'd like to tweak it and change a few things that it's more what I really said at the time. But make your dialogue sound natural, as though, again, you're writing a novel. Okay, chapter breaks, and we're going to move very quickly through this because I'm leaving you a lot of examples. Just though you're writing a novel, again, you want to write in chapters where your chapters are going to break at a point that's going to grab your reader's attention and make them want to turn that page, just as you're bringing them in at the beginning with that excitement of the story. And here are just a few ways to end your chapter breaks, and I'm giving you quite a few of examples as you go along. But you can end with a significant scene. You can end with a question. You can end a return to the theme. And here's a few examples. Action scene, Forgiven. That moment when the mother discovers that her son is the person who perpetrated this terrible crime. Suspense. What's coming upon us? What's coming next? With a question. Was there a place in this vast new country called the United States for a Karen refugee to build a new life and home out of Ye Wen's story? We're coming back to the theme. And if you look at this one, it ends up with that whole theme of I am going to find God. Then I kept that vow, or rather God did. So make sure as you're writing that your chapters themselves have a good cutoff. So we have just 3 minutes left, and we're coming to the end of how to write this book. And I want to leave this, and then we'll have time for questions. I want to stress this because this is one of the parts that when I get manuscripts of this type of book, so often it's left out. And that is that just as you need a prologue that's going to come in and introduce your subject, introduce your theme, introduce the life story or crisis that the book's going to be about, you need to, at the end with an epilogue. When your story ends, the story hasn't ended. And the reason is your readers by this time have bonded with you, with your subject, whether it's your story, whether it's someone else. They have bonded, and they don't just want to know how that last scene ended. They want to know where you are today. And so I call this the bookends of this type of a memoir. You come in with the prologue, with introducing yourself and your theme and your story. And then at the end, you need to consciously say, I am now where I am right now, writing this book in this particular time and place. I am now going to say goodbye to these readers who have become part of my story. And here is what your epilogue needs. It needs a solid ending, and it's what I call an up to this point. Scripture, Moses told the people, to this point, God has taken us. And then he began in Deuteronomy to tell the entire backstory of the Israelites and their walk through the wilderness to that point that they're now standing ready to move into the promise. And that's what your reader needs at this point. Up to this point, where has God taken you? Your story that you're writing may have ended action-wise a dozen years earlier, but you're sitting here today writing your story or writing a person's story, and the reader needs to know where they are today. especially if the subject is still alive. The book also needs to come back to your opening theme, your opening image, your open hook. If that sounds complicated, I've given you some examples just from my own books. Here was All Saints. The theme became faith, community, mission. And so in that epilogue, we come back to those words that sum up the ultimate miracle of All Saints, which is God bringing his children from opposite sides of the world to become one community of faith with a mission. And so that became the epilogue of that book. Dancing from Darkness. We started out with that theme of the puzzle pieces. And you will notice at just the last line there, when the last puzzle pieces fit into place, we will see and understand the beautiful picture God is creating of our lives. And so that is that last word coming back to that theme, forgiven. The theme is forgiven. And so coming back to that valley and the storms and an ending, I am at peace, I am loved, I am forgiven. So don't leave your reader hanging without an epilogue, because they need you to say goodbye to them, and invite them to and challenge them to move forward with their story, with their lives. So that is the end of the basic material. We're going to open up now for chat. I will let Ramon step back in, and just to notice that on the screen is my address. If you have questions that you don't have time in this chat to cover, feel free to email me them, and I will happily introduce them or answer them personally.
Thank you so much, Jeanette. Really, you've covered the material in the time that we have talked about, and I'm sure our audience, our participants, they have a lot of questions. A comment from Joanne, that's great material. Yes, I hope you will go back to the notes, to the handouts, and I will share with you the PowerPoint slides so you can go back and review the session. Any questions from our participants? We're open for questions.
Let me add a point while people are writing questions.
Okay.
Maybe just to add in as we're waiting for questions. I have covered this as a collaborative memoir because we were limited time, but I hope you notice how if you are writing your own autobiography, these principles apply. And one of the great difficulties of writing the autobiography that people deal with, and perhaps you're looking to write yours, is struggling to get the words down on paper. Mm-hmm. And so one of the simplest ways to do this that I often recommend, even if it's your story, is to tell it to somebody else. You be the interview person. Get another person, go through exactly what I said and say, okay, will you be willing to spend 20 hours with me on various nights of the week over a certain period of time? Will you, be the one just to prod me and ask questions if I'm not clear, and basically take the interviews, and you'll find out that if you can just tell your story to another person with all of that part of the heart that comes in, all you then have to do is transcribe that into text, and you will basically have either a full manuscript that you can edit yourself, or raw material that you can hire a professional editor to then turn into that autobiography. Mm-hmm.
I have a quick question, Jeanette. What is the Dragon program? Is that something that you buy, download, or?
Yes. The Dragon program is, and it sadly does not work well for multiple people, because it's a program that learns to recognize your voice. It's the same one that if you talk into your phone or instruments, it will capture your text and upload it to the computer.
I see.
And so
so instead of typing,
find it easier to speak. Yes,
and then
you just talk.
You just talk, and the program will pick up what is said, and it will appear on your screen.
Yes, it turns it into text. I tried to use this for just general interviews, and I discovered it recognizes your voice.
I see.
So when you try to interview people, it will make a mess at uploading it onto the screen, which is I type it. But if
Okay.
you're telling your story to somebody else, it's very easy to then just turn on your Dragon and let all of your raw material be uploaded in text into your computer, even as you're telling the story to someone else.
We have to
And
pay.
I see we have a question.
Okay.
Yes, it says assume reader ignorance in the notes. That was one of the points left out for time. But it is simply too often when people are telling their story, they're used to telling it to family, to people who live around them, and so they leave key details. I just finished a story where it was in the last chapter of this manuscript that they finally revealed what continent the story was on. And that was because they referenced all of Pennsylvania. And I thought, oh, this is set in Pennsylvania, you know. So you need to assume reader ignorance. And the way I say to do this easily is as you're writing your book or as you're editing, you know, as you're writing the story, think of your audience as a person. And I always say, pick an English-speaking person who is a total stranger of another English-speaking country. If you're in America, choose Australian. If you're Nigerian, choose a New Zealander. What details do you need to include in the story so this totally different person from a different part of the world who's reading it in your language can see and understand every single detail?
Mm-hmm.
So I hope that's helpful.
Yeah.
I see we have one from John. Okay, I think that's to other people. Is this to me, John?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Have you ever found it helpful to have a spouse or close family member listen in? Actually, I find it isn't helpful because people cannot truly, I become basically their confessional. And I just finished a book that will be coming out in another month from Afghanistan. And it's, again, a weaving back and forth of the John and Jean Weaver story inside Afghanistan, if you remember that particular book in 9/11. And I did their interviews completely separate, also with All Saints. The reason was they could be more intimate in pouring out their own heart to me if they were just talking to me than knowing that somebody's listening and having to evaluate their words according to what's said. That said, when I wrote the book, both spouses read it and even vetoed a few things that the others said that had made it in. And that's part of the editing process, is I always make sure that every word in the book, even if it's something that they said in an interview, this is not a gotcha journalism like politics. I make sure that once they've had time to think, they may say, this was too intimate, I don't want it in print, or whatever. But I find it's much easier to do the interviews completely with one person at a time.
One person, okay.
Okay, it says, how many pages do you estimate you have to write per one page that ends up in the book? I don't do it by pages, of course, because it's on a computer screen these days. So I do it by word count. And typically by the time I have finished my note gathering and interviews, I only say this for me, it has been fairly consistent that I will have a good 40,000 words of notes, which means by the time I sort through all those notes and I'm writing all the scenes into powerful, well-written scenes, and I'm doing the background research, and I'm interweaving the political and geographical and historical context in, I usually end up with about 65,000 words.
65,000.
And then I trim. Yeah, but it's because I'm wordy. My editors know that. So they trust me that once I get it all down, then I will weave. Usually I have a word count. So with Baker Group, with All Saints, Forgiven, my word count, it had to be between 50 and 55,000. So once I have what is essential down, then it's much easier to go back and say, okay, where can we trim? And in All Saints, we trimmed a lot of backstory that wasn't necessary to make sure that the ongoing action story stayed. but it's easier to just write a lot and trim than not to have enough material.
Yes, thank you for that question, Tabitha. Let's turn to the Q&A window. John Campbell is asking, what's the difference between biography and memoir? Memoir.
One's French and English. Basically, a memoir is a biography. The difference is a biography typically implies the entire life story of a person whose story people care about. Usually like Billy Graham. A memoir may often just focus around the particular events that inspire, like 90 Minutes is a good example of a memoir. Nobody would have written that person's whole life biography if they hadn't spent 90 minutes dead. The same with the Amish school shooting. An ordinary, devout Christian mother involved in missions and serving the Lord is not somebody whose biography would be written. But because of her involvement in the events of the Amish school shooting and her family and what God did through that, in taking that message of forgiveness literally globally, made her story worth telling. But it's a memoir, so it has all her backstory, but it focuses on the events that prompted the story to be written. So I would say that all biographies are memoirs, but not all memoirs are biographies.
Thank you. Bernice has a question here. Jeanette, do you ever send your interview questions ahead of time so they can prepare before you speak to them?
Actually, that's a secondary question because I'm also an investigative missions journalist. So I do a lot of interviews that end up in article form and all over the world. And those I have discovered it's much easier. I often don't do live interviews at all because I will send the interview questions, whether it's about their ministry, their lives, a particular event, just your typical journalism. And they will find it easier since many of them are not English first language even. To write out, again, in raw notes. Sometimes I've received 20 pages of single-spaced material on a person's ministry that I'm having to boil down into a 1,200-word article. The reason I don't do that with an interview with a book is because, one, by the time I'm contracted to write the book, the story is out there. There's a reason why it's been told. And so the person has typically told their story. It's been, either on the news or Christian radio or whatever, and the basic story is there. And I can't really know, they know their story. I can't really know what to ask until I'm sitting in front of them, hearing them tell their story, and then prompting them to fill in because typically they will leave gaps in their story because, again, they're used to telling it to people who know who they are. And so I find it in that case, there's not much point in interview questions when you're referencing an entire book length of interviews. You just have to ask them to tell their story. For an article, definitely.
Have you done have you used let's say, Skype to interview people? They are not present, face to face. Have you done that?
We actually started with Skype, and when I did Hope Underground, which was the mine rescue was October 2010. That book they wanted for the anniversary, as in October 2011, and it was the most stressful turnaround in less than 3 months, writing that book in 3 languages on 3 continents, and I wrote 2 of the languages myself, Spanish and English. And we were doing Skype interviews with Chile and with South Africa, and it was so stressful. And what I discovered, which is why I appreciate Bernice's question, is I discovered that in Skype, you have a small window, and you don't necessarily get from the person in that window of talking. You don't have opportunity to spend 20 or 30 hours face to face. Often what you really want from them, they will not say in the Skype interview. And that's when I really switched to the questions, because I realized I could write out those questions. And at first it would be giving them the opportunity to think through the questions, answer them thoroughly, and then we'd get on Skype and discuss them. And that it ended up becoming so effective that most of that type of interview, we have rarely gone to the Skype, because I will simply follow up through chat or email on what I need to know of what they've written down as answers. So that works, but if you're going to write an entire book, you really need to have some face-to-face time with your principal. And I just budget that in. The publisher will usually pay travel expenses for me to at least go down and spend 2 or 3 days in intensive one-on-one, at least with the principal subject.
Okay. Jacob Samuel is asking, are you supposed to divulge even the negative areas in the life of a person, or you just concentrate on the positive? How?
Both. In fact, the book that I have just been contracted to write is a story of someone who came to Christ through 4 years spent in a maximum security prison. So, and it's going to be a movie. And so that negative part of his life is what brought about the positive. And so you have to be careful on this, and that if you're writing a memoir that's not your own and it's been contracted to write a memoir, it has to tell the story, or the person has to approve of what you're writing, or the publisher, because it's their story. But typically, negative is part of what brings the positive. I did a book called My Altered Self, and it was the story of a woman whose personal dissociative multiple personality disorder was what saved her life through terrible childhood abuse and trauma and brought her to Christ. And so that terrible, painful life and all of the problems of that very negative parts of life is what led to the positive. And so, usually if they want their story told, they're willing to have that, but you also have to walk that narrow line of, one, they get to approve what's in print, and two, this isn't gotcha journalism where it's like, let's grab off the record whatever they say and put it out in print to embarrass them.
Okay. Thank you for that answer, and thank you for that question, Jacob. Benjamin is saying, how do you know the person is telling the truth?
Well, that is where investigation comes in, and it is hard if you have somebody just telling you a story. In fact, when I wrote All Saints, I could document the Tennessee dying church part of the story because it was all there. But documenting the Myanmar war refugee stories and making sure they were real was not easy. But it was incredible how when I actually did that research, I was able, like Ye Win, the boy soldier, I was able to document that when he told the story of being in the riots when the great Myanmar democracy activist was on home arrest and had this big rally and he was caught in it and running, I matched every detail that he told me as a 16-year-old boy to what actually happened. And again, finding, when he's telling these stories about becoming the voice and the face of the pro-democracy student marches in front of the Myanmar embassy in Thailand, to be able to actually go through and find, and I looked at every single news brought from the period that covered those riots, and to be able to see it, and I sent him the clip that I found. He did not know it was in existence because it was 1998. And to be able to say, okay, there he is with the flag in his hand, with his fist knee, with that fury on his face. He was telling me the truth. Okay. So it is important to document, and if you can simply go back and look at the news and the reality and the geographical and say, okay, at least every detail is matching so clearly that they would have to really try to make this stuff up. And they would have really had to research it themselves to lie. That's as far as you can go.
Okay. Do your research and check, fact check. Okay, let's turn to, okay, Laura. Oh, just a comment from Laura. This has been such an inspiration. Thank you for that
My
feedback,
pleasure.
Laura. Thank you so much. Charlie has a question. Do the principles and methods of writing a biography apply to writing the story or biography of a movement?
Yes. Yes, and John Moss' new song in the Andes is a great example of that, because it's the story of the entire movement of the Quechua people to Christ in Ecuador. And that has been my full. And so thank you, John, if you're still out there. But yes, it's the same principle, and that you are going to collect stories. You're going to collect those scenes, and only at this time it will often be the stories told by many, many people. In the Hope Underground, the Chilean miner, my chronology skeleton was the chaplain of Camp Esperanza, whose core story was being told. But I wove, and I had to do a lot of research and interviews, the stories of so many other people who were a part of that, interweaving that into the story. And so if you're doing stories of a movement, and the same with all, I had probably 20 plus other interviews and people whose snippets of story came into the book. And the easiest way is to take those stories down and then form your chronology, form that timeline, and then tell their stories in the timeline, however many there are, and then weave in all of the background material of the movement that's going to be tied together, or that is tying together these individual exciting stories that happened during the movement.
Okay, thank you for that. Oh, Charlie has an additional comment here. In the 1970s, my dorm parent in Quito, Ecuador, was one of the missionaries who participated in that movement of the, how do you pronounce that?
Alliance Academy, yes.
Fire on
Hi,
the
Charlie.
Paramo.
I have been in Quito, Ecuador. In fact, the first Latin American Christian Writers Conference I ever taught was at the HCJB headquarters there in Quito, Ecuador. And we stayed at the Alliance Academy.
Thank you for that. Thank you, Charlie. Okay, do we have any other questions from the floor? Have we answered all of your questions? I hope, well, thank you for participating. This has been a, yeah, I think a productive time. I hope you have been inspired, you've been motivated, and you have your writing projects in your mind as you listen to Jeanette and her presentation. Again, we will send you the set of slides. And if you have any other question, follow-up question, feel free to email Jeanette. Her email is on screen, Jeanette@JeanetteWindle.com. So thank you so much. Thank you, Benjamin. Thank you all for joining us live. Thank you for your active participation, all of your questions, your encouraging words. Thank you so much. Thank you, Jeanette.
It has been my pleasure.
Yeah, you have shared very generously and from your experience and insights. Thank you for being the servant for this webinar. So I hope to see all of you again in our future webinars. So watch out for our announcements. The Lord bless you and keep you. And until our next webinar, God bless you all.